the Youth Endowment Fund website as well. So recording has started, brilliant. We'll just give it a couple of minutes because we're getting a huge number of people joining, which is absolutely brilliant. And there's still quite a number of people in the lobby, so we'll just give them an opportunity to get in before we make a start. We'll try to do that, Lavender. I've just seen your message in the chat, so Kaylin will try and turn your camera off.
I've just replied, but it looks off to me. I'm not getting any visuals coming through.
I'll try. Thanks, Kaylin. Still people coming through, but I think we'll make a start. And I'm sure there will be other people joining us as we move forward. So today's session is about domestic abuse and what may or may not work in the evidence field. And we're going to start off today with Stephanie Waddell, who is an assistant director at Foundations and also leading on the REACH plan at Foundations, which Steph will be talking us through in a moment. Steph will be presenting. There's opportunity for you to put any questions that you have in the chat. We will pick them up at the end of Steph's presentation, and we'll also at the end of the presentation give opportunity for you to put a virtual hand up and ask questions that way as well. We have, just before Steph starts, we have muted everybody here today. We have been taking some extra security measures with our virtual learning cafes recently, as we had some interference at one before Christmas, and we're very aware that in the charity sector this is becoming an increasing problem. So that's why you are muted at the moment, but if you have a question, we'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to speak. So we'll start with Steph. I will introduce each of the presenters as we go, but we're starting with Steph first. And Kaylin, would you like to share Steph's slides, please, and unmute Steph?
Thanks, Gail, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here and talking to you all about our work and our ambitions in the space of evaluation of support for child victims of domestic abuse. Kaylin, if you could go to the first slide. So I will talk through 5 things. So a little bit about children as victims of domestic abuse, much of which you may know already, but just useful context, I think, for the session today. I'll talk a bit about availability of support for children, the challenges of evaluation in this context, and then our work at Foundations to date, and our ambitions around a longer term, more ambitious evaluation programme. Could you move on, please? So, the impacts of domestic abuse on children, as I'm sure we'll all know, are both wide-ranging and long-lasting. The latest, it's an old prevalence figure, but it still feels about right, affects an estimated 1 in 5 children. Worth saying here that data on domestic abuse and child victims of domestic abuse is really limited. So this is very much a prevalence estimate. And we know, a range of, as I say, long-lasting and serious impacts. So experiencing domestic abuse in childhood doubles the risk of a serious adult mental health problem, for example. Crucially, it triples the risk of either becoming a victim or a perpetrator in later life. It increases the risk of child abuse and neglect. Oh, I've had a message saying we're unable to see the slides, Kaylin. I'll pause.
Oh dear. Okay. Thank you so
That's
much
serious.
for messaging about that. Oh, Rachel said
Oh,
you can
okay.
see them.
Lots of people can.
Okay.
Okay.
They are coming through.
Caleb,
I'll carry
if you
on.
just mute yourself, and I'm just, it looks as though it's probably just a problem with one person who said they can't see the slides. It looks like they're fine for most people.
Great. I'll carry on. So yeah, domestic abuse increases the risk of child abuse and neglect by impacting on parents' capacity to provide the kind of sensitive and responsive parenting that we know children need. And we know that it's a major driver of children's social care demand. And I guess just worth emphasising here in terms of our sort of government conversations that children who are victims of domestic abuse really sit between the Opportunity Mission and Safer Streets mission. So we know kind of multiple departments with an interest, but really speaks to both of those government missions. And as many of you will know, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 took the step of recognising children as direct victims for the first time, really in recognition of this direct impact on child victims. Next slide, please. So what we also know, and we're learning more about, is that support for these children is both patchy and, as much of the support in the sector, chronically underfunded. So a chronic underinvestment generally in sector provision around domestic abuse support. Lots of provision is very grassroots and small scale. Most isn't strategically commissioned locally. It's dependent instead in small pots of year-to-year funding. And we know that therapeutic services for child victims is particularly limited. So the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office are doing some great work in this area to look more closely at availability of support for children. They found in the past that only 29% of the victim survivors they surveyed who'd sought support for their children had managed to access that support. And they're currently carrying out more work to look at that, what support's available, which we're all eagerly awaiting. They're due to report in April, but yeah, highly unlikely that it shows us anything other than real kind of lack of supply of this kind of support in relation to demand for it. Next slide, please. So this is the context really where we, as one of the What Works centres in this space, start to get kind of really interested in the lack of evaluation. So there hasn't been nearly enough, sorry, not early enough investment in evaluation in that kind of context of real financial challenges for the sector. And the first thing I wanted to say that we're being very careful to say every time we talk about this is that there have been huge efforts to evaluate from within the sector. So this is not to downplay any of that work that's gone on. But from a What Works perspective, there are no UK impact evaluations that we've come across or found that can tell us what works to support child victims. And most evidence about preventative work is from the US. So this for us is a kind of major and unsustainable evidence gap that we really need to work to fill. We previously had a look at support services, identified more than 100, less than a third had been evaluated at all. And the evaluations that had been carried out were unable to tell us whether the services had achieved their intended outcomes. And just to say, you know, impact evaluation is one thing. It isn't the be all and end all for sure. It's what we're particularly interested in as the What Works Centre. Doesn't answer every question about services, certainly, but our perspective is it's a really important part of the picture and can strengthen services, both those services that are going through that kind of evaluation journey and pipeline, and also services more broadly through the kinds of insights that that work can generate. Next slide, please. And it's challenging for all kinds of reasons. These are just a few of them. You know, there's a reason that there's not a lot of impact evaluation in this space. So We've lacked standard outcomes for services for children and agreed to measure these, although worth saying that the work led by UCL to develop a common outcomes framework is really moving us forward here. Still lots to do in terms of consistent and validated measures. As I've said, limited availability of data about children affected by domestic abuse. And then in terms of services and the nature of services, services are often very individualized, very responsive to individual needs, very adaptive. That makes it kind of really challenging actually to, you know, describe that kind of service model as a basis for evaluation. And, you know, lots of, as I've said, very grassroots organisations, including by and for services, which we know are a really vital part of the local landscape, but often operating at a very small scale. So finding ways to include those kinds of organisations in an evaluation programme is challenging but essential. Next slide, please. So at Foundations, we've started to support evaluation in the sector. We have 6 projects ongoing. You're going to hear about Fathers for Change in a bit. So, and they're at various stages of what we would usually describe as the evaluation pipeline. So 2 at the stage of kind of pre-feasibility work, so very early stage to think about refining theories of change, for example, really think about outcomes, really think about describing the service and the model. 1 at feasibility study stage, 3 at pilot impact evaluation stage, and nothing yet at full-scale impact evaluation. That is our aim. However, kind of really worth emphasising that we're not interested in kind of rushing anybody through these stages, or even progressing through these stages if it doesn't feel like the right thing or the right time for particular services. We're interested in the kind of inherent value of each of these stages in terms of what it can teach us about how we progress to full-scale impact evaluation. Okay, next slide, please. So this is one of the projects that we're working with, Bounce Back for Kids, which is led by PACT, Parents and Children Together. So just to give you a sense of this, so this is a trauma and therapeutically informed group approach, and it supports child victims and also their non-perpetrating parents, children aged 3 to 11. 8 to 12 weekly sessions, depending on the age of the child. And it's group support, which is seen as helping individuals to kind of see resilience in others who share similar experiences. So that's the basic model. And then next slide, please. The evaluation that we've got ongoing at the moment is a pilot impact study. It's led by IFF for us. And it includes an implementation and process evaluation, an impact evaluation in the form of a waitlist randomized control trial, and a cost evaluation. So very exciting for us to get a project to this stage, actually. And the purpose of a pilot impact evaluation at this stage is both kind of assessing evidence of promise, but also crucially exploring the viability of moving to a full-scale impact evaluation. So a sort of crucial stage for us in our pipeline, and a huge amount of work that goes into this in partnership with the delivery organisation and our evaluators. Next slide, please. At a different stage, we're working with the Restart project, so delivered by the Drive Partnership in Cranston. Really interesting project, brings together children's social care, housing and domestic abuse services with the aim of identifying and responding to patterns of harmful behaviour at an earlier stage. So one-to-one interventions with the perpetrator based around behaviour change, but also ensuring safety and support for the non-abusive parent, and interestingly incorporates a housing approach, so seeking alternative accommodation for the perpetrator, allowing the child and adult victims to remain safe at home. Incorporates the foundations of Safe and Together training for children's social care and housing professionals. So quite an interesting sort of multi-component intervention for us. Next slide, please. And this is at feasibility study stage. So Cordis Bright are our evaluation partners on this project. So at this stage, really aiming to investigate the programme in more detail. So looking at the underpinning theory and the underpinning evidence base, intended activities, outcomes, implementation, and also start to think about whether and how future impact evaluation could be carried out. So just 2 examples there, and you'll hear more about Fathers for Change after this, which is another one of our projects. Next slide, please. So we've started, we're learning a huge amount through the work with those 6 projects. I think we're starting to prove that, you know, impact evaluation is possible here. And, you know, it's a very intensive process and very kind of important partnerships for us. At the same time, we're continuing, we've been calling for a while for investment in a more ambitious long-term evaluation programme. In May, pre-election, we published this document here, Researching Effective Approaches for Children. We're calling it our REACH plan. And this was really a sort of call to the new government to fill the evidence gap, to really commit to a long-term programme of evaluation that would help us find out what works, both to prevent domestic abuse and to support child victims. The plan sets out a 5-year roadmap for work with the sector to generate these kinds of what works findings. And it's essentially a funnel approach whereby we would need to work with a wide range of services in those very early stages of evaluation, with a smaller number progressing kind of, if feasible, if appropriate, to full-scale impact evaluation and hopefully generating findings. We costed the plan at £75 million over 5 years. And when I say that number, you know, depending on where you're sitting, if you're an evaluator, you think, really, only that? And if you're somebody in government or in a local authority, you think, gosh, that's a huge amount of money. You know, it's a realistic, we think, assessment of the work that's needed and the kind of commitment that's needed from government to get us to the stage of knowing, you know, really seeing a step change in what we know about what works to support children. So yeah, we're continuing to make the case for this more ambitious programme. We've committed £2 million of our own funding for the next few years. So we will continue to do this, and we're busy seeking match funding and continuing to try to influence government in this space. So our ambition is there. Next slide, please. And just to say, really, you know, this plan is about enabling evaluation of services across the spectrum of support. So from universal prevention, so schools-based approaches, and YEF, I know, kind of very interested here. So schools-based healthy relationship work, for example. Targeted prevention, so this might be targeting particular groups identified as at risk. So intensive home visiting, for example, for young first-time parents, or indeed targeted prevention with young people displaying harmful behaviours. Family-based approaches, so some of these incorporating perpetrator work, very much working systemically with the whole family. Perpetrator work, different kinds of perpetrator work, including group-based perpetrator programs, for example, behaviour change programs, and then crucially therapeutic support for victims, particularly child victims, or work with children and the adult victim together. And then the 2 lines across the bottom, sort of crucially, I suppose, for us, important to include, as I've said, by and for and grassroots provision. And then, you know, the most difficult to evaluate for sure, but potentially the most interesting, these sort of system level interventions. So including workforce training, including multi-agency approaches or other sort of multi-component interventions. So that is our ambition. That's my last slide. Just about on time, I think. So yeah, I'd be really interested in questions or indeed comments and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Steph, and you're bang on time, which is fantastic. And that was so interesting. Oh, someone's applauding you as well. That was so interesting, and I'm sure there are I can see some people with their hands up already. There's a couple of comments in the chat which shall just read out for you, Steph, to see if you can be sort of reflecting on these. So, comment from Lavender: can we have a reference for the statistic that you quoted near the beginning, that childhood domestic abuse triples the risk of young people becoming a later victim or perpetrator? And a follow-on question to that from Kareen, who's also interested in that, and specifically the possible increased risk of displaying harmful sexual behaviour.
Yes.
Helen, do you want to just take the slide, stop sharing the slides as well?
Yeah, sorry, I haven't got the reference in my head, but I was trying to find it live, but I might give up on that and just put it in the chat in a minute when I'm not talking, if that's all right, but I'll hook it out for you. And then there's another question in the chat I see: how do you select services pilots to evaluate? Which is a good question. So the 6 that we're working with, we ran an open call process essentially, and assessed on kind of essentially, you know, promised to sort of go through these stages of evaluation. I mean, the more interesting question for me in some ways is sort of where next, and particularly how do we run a sort of transparent but also inclusive process? You know, I think we need to do a lot more and think about that kind of process if we're really going to engage those very small grassroots organisations that we want to, and kind of facilitate, you know, that ability to kind of work with us. So yeah, open call so far, but I think we need to get more creative as we move forward, and particularly as our ambition ramps up.
Thanks, Steph. We've got a few people with their hands up as well. Kaylin, would you unmute Sandra Beaton, please? Sandra, do you want to say whereabouts you from and your question?
So you can unmute yourself. I've enabled it, so you'll need to unmute yourself first and then go for it when you're ready. I think Sandra may have stepped away, so we've
Shall we? Yeah, we'll go to Matt next.
Allowing your mic now, Matt. Go for it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Fabulous. First of all, Stephanie, thanks so much for that presentation. I found it really interesting, and particularly about the preventative work and side of things. I work for an organisation called Loudmouth Education and Training, and we provide theatre education programmes around many safeguarding topics, covering topics like domestic abuse. And it was really interesting about you talking about evaluation and how can we prove that some of these interventions work. And something we've been doing at Loudmouth a lot is about the recording of disclosures. And so last year at Loudmouth, our staff received 133 disclosures, and 29 of those were around domestic abuse, and 12 of them were around child abuse. And for many of the schools we were working in, they said that these were young people who were not on their radar, they had no prior concerns about, and it showed them the value of the work and the impact it was having to create that safe space for young people to be able to identify what was going on in their own lives through the fictional characters they were seeing, and also then know where to go for help and support. And it meant then we could then work with the school to put the safeguarding policies into place for there. So it's more about really being open to having more discussions with people today, to chat about these interventions and how they can support, and particularly with some of the data we've got. I'm absolutely happy to share that with people if they'd like more information about that.
Great, thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. That's great. We're going to see if we can get Sandra in again. Sandra, do you want to try and unmute again? And if not, would you mind putting your question in the chat and then we'll pick it up that way? Doesn't look like we're working. Could you put no worries, Sandra. Just put your question in the chat if that's okay.
She has already
done it.
Brilliant.
the question, just for the everyone else, the question is about MASHs and the evaluation of effectiveness, especially where a family is subject to both MASH and MARAP. Sorry, not.
Yeah, really good question. Gosh, MASH is one of those that, I mean, these processes are these things that are just so difficult to evaluate because there's so much variation. We've got an evaluation of MASH ongoing, actually. It's due to conclude fairly soon, but it's not, it's not an impact evaluation, I'm afraid. It's useful. It'll give us some really good insight, I think. But we're really at the level of sort of process evaluation, looking at kind of really describing those different multi-agency models when we're a bit of a way off being able to evaluate for impact. It's really the holy grail, I think, what we'd like to be able to do.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Steph. Any final questions for Steph before we move on to the next presenter? We've just got a comment in there, Steph. Sandra coming back there.
Interesting.
Oh, we have got another question from Corinne. Is Corinne able to unmute, Kaylin?
You now have the permission.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, thank you so much. I found that really, really interesting. My name's Corinne. I work in the NSPCC, so I'm based down in Plymouth, and I'm in a project called Together for Childhood. Really interested in your kind of evaluation approach to things. Particularly interested, as I sort of said in the chat, about those kind of primary and secondary sort of prevention responses. So primary, I said universal, and those where you've kind of got a little bit more information there. Just wondering if there are any sort of specific activities or projects that are working in that space that you could kind of point me in the direction of that I could maybe make contact with.
I think we've not done any really useful mapping, Corinne. I think this is where the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's work is going to be really helpful. So I think I'd advise you to look out for that. It's due out in April, and they've done some really comprehensive mapping and against different areas of work. So point to them rather than us. We're likely to have a sort of slightly random list of things we've come across rather than anything comprehensive.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'll look out for that. Thanks.
Great, thank you ever so much, Corinne, for that question. We shall move on now, but if you do have any more questions for Steph at the end, we'll hopefully have a bit of time if on reflection you want to ask further questions. So do hold on to them or continue to put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I would like to introduce Lily Wagstaff and Jack Martin from the Behavioural Insights team, who have been working with foundations for quite some time on the Fathers for Change programme and have been specifically supporting the implementation of Fathers for Change. Lily and Jack are going to be presenting now. Again, they have around a 20-minute presentation. If you've got any questions, the burning questions that you think about as they present, just pop them in the chat, and similar to our conversation with Steph, we'll give opportunity for asking them both some questions in a little while after the presentation. Over to you, Lily and Jack.
Thanks, Gail, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Jack from the Behavioural Insights team, and I'm joined by my colleague, Lily. And we're here to tell you about an interesting project that we've been supporting foundations on, which sits within the REACH plan that Steph was just telling us about. And that project is the evaluation of a programme called Fathers for Change. Next slide, please, Kaylin. And the next one, please. Thanks. So I won't say lots and lots about the programme itself because we've been asked to mainly speak about our methodology. So our presentation will probably be a bit different than the others today. But Fathers for Change is a really interesting programme. It's from the United States and it hasn't really been delivered outside of the US. It's predominantly a perpetrator-focused domestic abuse programme, but also has components for both the co-parent victim survivor and their children. So it takes this family level approach. And it was identified as a promising project by colleagues at Foundation because of its evidence of impact from the US. My understanding is that having robust RCT evidence of reducing domestic abuse incidents and reducing children's exposure to them is relatively rare in programs of this specific category. So we know there's something to this. It's something that has helped people, but the question is, can we do it here in the UK? And when you're implementing a new service in a new context, many funders, delivery organizations, and evaluators rightly take a cautious and staged approach. So exactly as Steph laid out, they'll firstly start with a feasibility study to show that the program can be delivered well. Then they might progress to a pilot RCT to show that the program can be evaluated well. And then they might progress to the big trial to determine if the service is actually having an impact. And that's broadly the shape of Foundation's planned work for Fathers for Change, provided each stage is successful. But where our work began was a stage prior to all of that, a pre-implementation stage focused on adapting the service for the UK. And just to define our terms quickly, adaptation in the literature is defined as a process of thoughtful and deliberate alteration to the design and delivery of an intervention to improve its fit in a new context. And our presentation today is very much about the methods and process associated with that. Next slide, please, Kaylin. Thanks. And the reason we started with that adaptation phase rather than jumping straight into delivery is that we know that transporting interventions from one place to another quite different place can be really, really tricky. It's easy to do wrong. And there are lots of examples of programs that have been brought over here because they've been shown to work in the US. But when we've tested them, we've actually found that they don't work here or they're much less impactful. And there's lots of theories about why that might be the case. And one of them is that in these cases, something has gone wrong with adaptation. And that's a sort of Goldilocks problem. So on the one hand, it's possible that some programs brought here aren't changed or modified enough. If you just drop a US-based service into the UK, the program might clash with preferences, values, and norms of participants or practitioners here, even if it doesn't in the US. The workforce required to deliver it well might not exist here, or there might be something about laws or policies in the UK that mean some aspect of the program just can't be delivered. And if some or any of those are true, then a program probably isn't going to flourish here. But on the other hand, it's possible that some programs are changed too much when they're brought here. A well-intentioned person trying to make sure that a service fits in well here might actually accidentally disrupt the elements of a program that actually make it effective, which we call core components. So there's a risk that the program effectively becomes damaged in transit. So the objective of our work was to avoid both horns of that and conduct good adaptation work that increases the chances of a program being feasible, acceptable, and impactful in the UK. Next slide, please, Kaylin. And one more, please. Thanks. So to try and achieve all of that, we had three key objectives and there were three key phases to our work. Firstly, we needed to fully understand the intervention and how it was delivered in its original setting. And importantly, we had to develop an understanding of the bits of the program that we had to preserve and protect throughout the adaptation process, the elements of the program that we think are essential for it to be effective, what shouldn't change. Secondly, we need to fully understand the new context the program is going to be transported into, the UK context. And on the basis of understanding the program, its original context and its new context, we then set out to identify what's known as mismatches, which really means an important difference between the US and UK context that might mean while Fathers for Change can be successful in the US, it might not be successful here. And then thirdly and finally, our objective was to adapt the intervention, which involves sifting through these mismatches, deciding if they're sufficiently serious that they need to be addressed, and then deciding how to address them by changing the program or the approach to delivering it, all the while keeping an eye on those core components and making sure that we don't cut the wrong wire. Next slide, please, Kaylin. So you can see here a sort of flowchart of the process that we went through with those three steps of understanding the intervention and original context, understanding the new context, and then adapting the intervention, which took us about 6 or 7 months. And the fourth possible next stage of the work, pending review of the progress we've made, is actually road testing that adapted intervention in the UK. So having looked at an overview of the 4 stages, I'll just quickly talk about the first and then hand over to Lily. Next slide, please, Kaylin. It might be 2 on. Oh, actually a few more on, please, Kaylin. That's it. Thank you so much. So to understand the program itself and its original context in the US, we did a lot of desk-based research, a review of all program documents that you can possibly imagine, a review of all evaluations of Fathers for Change, and a rapid review of reviews of research relating to similar programs. We also interviewed key program personnel from the US, including the developer, and Lily went to Connecticut to meet teams delivering the intervention there. Next slide, please, Kaylin. So on the basis of that desk-based and qualitative work, we were able to populate a number of outputs, which together effectively amount to writing down in a structured way what the intervention is and what's required to deliver it, the implementation challenges encountered in the US and the strategies used to overcome them, and what the core unchangeable parts of the intervention are, with the idea that this would set us up to then learn about the UK context and make comparisons to identify potential problems. And that's probably it from me. Thanks very much. And I'll hand over to Lily.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Can we go next? It might be 2 more again. Sorry for all the extra slides. So yeah, just phase 2 was focused on, oh, sorry, one back, sorry. Yeah, so phase 2 was focused on understanding the UK context. Jack and I came into this as kind of to facilitate the process of the adaptation. We're by no means experts on domestic abuse and the area that we were delivering the program in. So we brought in a lot of experts to try and understand the UK context and, as Jack said, identify those mismatches that might exist between the US and the UK. So we started with some workshops with the delivery organisations. So Fatherhood Institute would be delivering this with St. Michael's Fellowship if we were to progress. And so we had 2 in-person half-day workshops with them, focusing on things like learning about the UK context and a similar programme that they deliver called Caring Dads, sharing what we'd learned about Fathers for Change and identifying any potential differences in the context. We also had a workshop where we literally took all the materials, sat down and participant-facing materials like the worksheets, and just sat there and kind of identified common mistakes or mismatches that wouldn't fit the UK. So it was a very kind of detailed process with the delivery organisations. We then went on to include the voices of those who would actually be participating in the programme. So we did one in-person focus group with 6 perpetrators who had received a similar programme and would have been eligible for this if it were to be delivered. And we had one online interview with the partner of a perpetrator who received the similar programme. We had intended to do more interviews with partners, but given the really short time period that we were working under, it was quite difficult to recruit, given their kind of interactions with the delivery partners were more limited than the perpetrators themselves. And then we went on to engage wider stakeholders. So we had 2 online interviews with researchers and topic experts in perpetrator and fatherhood-based interventions, and 5 online interviews with local multi-agency partners, so social workers, referrers, anyone who would kind of be engaging in this program from the kind of referring side. And this also included talking to Respect, which is the biggest charity on perpetrator interventions as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the workshop with the delivery staff, so Fatherhood Institute and St. Michael's, we structured them around kind of a typical user journey of delivering a program. So starting with the kind of referrals, identifying participants, getting them in the door. So that could be a very different process in the US to the UK. So we really wanted to understand what that process would be here. We then looked into kind of who would actually receive the intervention and how we'd get them to take it up and be engaged in the program. And then moving on to kind of preparing for the delivery. So what do we actually need? What are the practitioners? A big difference between the US and the UK is the kind of qualifications or requirements to be a practitioner. And so that was something we spent a lot of time on, but also just what are the materials and things like that. Then going into kind of the delivery, so what activities and core components of the intervention were kind of included, and what would be different in the UK or the US versus, what would be more acceptable here or not. Supporting delivery, so what training, supervision, things like that goes on to support the practitioners in the UK. And then finally, outcomes. So what's the actual change we want to see and create, and how are we going to measure that? And the value add. So the big difference in the UK versus the US is what's offered, what's currently available, what's a similar program, and how does this compare? Next slide, please. Perfect. In terms of the participatory research and getting the voices from the actual participants, this was delivered by someone in our team who's a clinical psychologist and has a lot of experience working with people from similar backgrounds. And we kind of formed it around a persona. So they were kind of introduced to this person called Jim, who was had a history of domestic abuse and had a child that would be the same age as someone taking part in the program. And we did this so that it wouldn't feel like targeted towards them, and it kind of gave them space and distance to feel like they could engage, but it wasn't about them as the perpetrator themselves. And we then walk them through kind of the user journey that someone would go through, so the various stages of the intervention, and ask them how they might feel, how this persona might feel. So for example, with the referrals, we kind of introduce them to how that might work and ask them how Jim might feel about the offer, what would he like or dislike about the program, and things like that. Going on throughout the journey as well, ending with the activities. So we talk them through all the activities of Fathers for Change and ask them how they might feel about certain phases or activities. And then we gave them some of the handouts that the perpetrators receive and asked them about the wording or the presentation and if there was anything they wanted to change. And next slide, please. So in terms of what we produced in this phase, it was mostly just identifying those mismatches. As Jack said, we called mismatches kind of any part of the program that might not work well in the UK and could impact its deliverability, acceptability, and evaluability. We created a very detailed mismatch log that had all these columns listed here, but basically was kind of categorizing it into the domain. So was it content, delivery, or implementation? Why we felt a mismatch was justified, or the kind of definition of that mismatch. What were the risks to addressing it or not addressing it, and kind of whether it was more surface level and or deeper and actually going to affect the core components of the program. Next slide, please. And one more, sorry. Perfect. So finally, we took all those insights and we started actually adapting the intervention to the UK. So the way we did this was kind of 3 stages. We started by categorizing the mismatches into various groups, and this helped us kind of identify themes and categories basically about where these mismatches fell. We then took those categories and over a series of 7 workshops, discussed them in detail with our adaptation group, which I'll talk a bit more about later on, and essentially kind of went through each mismatch and identified some potential adaptations and whether that would be appropriate or whether that would change the program itself in more detail. And then finally, once we've had proposed adaptations that the delivery partner had taken away and kind of formalized, we had a roundtable with foundations, the funder, Fatherhood Institute, and discussed kind of the final proposals and signed off on those adaptations themselves. Next slide, please. So these were just kind of the categories that the mismatches broadly fell into. We found it quite helpful, again, to think of it as a journey. So starting with kind of initial due diligence, so the broader system and potentially some standards to meet in the UK. And then onboarding the workforce. So who are the kind of people that we need to actually deliver this? What are their backgrounds? What are their qualifications? Onboarding families and fathers. So what are who are we trying to onboard? How are we going to get them referred, and how are we going to get them to take it up? Then delivering the program, and then the final one, a bit more kind of detailed and specific, was just actual materials and branding and the actual participant facing materials that they would see. Next slide, please. So all the mismatches and adaptations were reviewed by our adaptation group, as I talked about, and this basically brought a number of different experts to the table bringing various views and opinions and experiences to the table to think about things and whether the adaptations were appropriate. So we had two people providing practitioner perspectives. We had a clinical psychologist and a social worker, and they were there to really think about things from the delivery and someone who was actually going to deliver this or refer someone into it. And then we had two academics who are experts in research into perpetrator interventions and have co-developed the Home Office standards for delivering perpetrator interventions. And so they really came from a perspective of, so I'm just seeing someone's lost sound. Can everyone else hear me? Okay, perfect. Great, thank you. So yeah, these academics brought in the experts of the standards and making sure we were meeting those basically. And then we had an adaptation expert who's done this process multiple times and was able to kind of tell us when we were veering too far from kind of the proposed adaptations and entering into changing the program essentially. Someone who's not on here, we also had the developer in all of those sessions as well, who was able to share kind of her views on any of the mismatches and the adaptations and how she felt that would feel to her as a developer and whether it would change the program too much. Next slide, please. So finally, as the beginning of the process, we had defined some progression criteria, which was essentially whether or not we should recommend progressing to the feasibility study. And essentially, how we defined these was just by achieving consensus on a number of issues. And by consensus, we mean kind of the absence of serious reservations, essentially. And the three elements we had were adequately addressing the mismatches. So did everyone feel like we've really thought about each mismatch and addressed it in a way that would ensure it wouldn't affect delivery? I see this is cut off a bit, but then the second one is we have adequately protected and preserved fathers for change core components. So we haven't changed the program too much and it still aligns with the evidence that has been produced in the US. And then finally, that we've adequately ensured our plans for delivery are kind of consistent with best practice and standards in the UK and that we're not veering too far away from those. Next slide, please. So for the final outputs for this, essentially the main output was a recommendation of whether to progress or not. And to inform that, we produced adapted versions of the materials that Jack spoke about. So detailing what delivery in the UK would look like. An adaptation log, which you'll see here, basically with detailing the proposed adaptations and the mismatches they were addressing. And then finally, an assessment of those progression criteria that I just spoke about. And then next slide, and I think that's our final. One more, sorry. Perfect. Yeah, I guess in terms of conclusions, this kind of highly structured process that involved populating some very detailed tools meant that we were able to complete a very comprehensive method to identify mismatches and issues. And so we feel that we were able to identify a number of mismatches more than we would have been able to with a lighter touch approach. And we're really able to get into that detail of those issues. And so we feel confident that we're now able to, if we did progress to feasibility, that delivery in the UK wouldn't be affected by any context-specific components. And so the feasibility, acceptability, and impact of the program wouldn't be affected by any kind of context issues that had arisen. And finally, we had, I think, having the diversity of stakeholders we had really ensured that we were able to not just identify the mismatches, but also find really helpful solutions to those. And the adaptations feel really kind of in line with with the program and what the program means to everyone and the developer, but also the UK context and ensuring that we're meeting that. And yeah, while it can be quite resource intensive, I think having the practitioners and potential participants in that process was really helpful as well, and helped us kind of broaden our horizons a bit more. But yeah, as I did say, recruiting partners of the perpetrators was a bit more difficult. So we have some plans to incorporate that into the feasibility if we were to progress. And I think the next slide is just space for questions. So I'll stop there, hopefully just on time as well.
Yeah, fantastic. That was so fascinating, Lily and Jack. Thank you so much for that. Kaylin, would you mind? Thank you. She's ahead of me. Any questions for Lily and Jack? I have been keeping an eye on the chat. I haven't seen any come through, though. Thank you, Steph, for answering some questions that have come through. Right, we've got one from Rhiannon Griffith. Kaylin, could you sort out the unmuting bit, and then Rhiannon can unmute herself?
Hello.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Lily and Jack. That was really interesting. I'm a public health registrar in Wales, and I was just wondering whether you had any feedback on the name of the programme in a UK context. And it might just be me, but for me, the Fathers For has kind of particular connotations and might suggest a particular theoretical background.
Hi, Rhiannon. I can have a first go at that one. So that did come up as one of these mismatches. So it's good to discuss some examples of what those mismatches actually are and what they look like. And that was raised. This is part of the benefit of speaking to so many different people from different areas in the sector. You sort of think you've discovered all of the issues, and then you speak to one extra person, and a few more come up. So yeah, absolutely. The name of the program was raised. Its association with sort of men's rights activist type groups, and that was something that was discussed at length. So yeah, absolutely. Lily, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think, yeah, exactly. It did come up. That's kind of came into the branding topic that we had. And yeah, I think as Jack said, it's one of those ones you probably wouldn't have thought about until you speak to someone who is an expert in that area. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks both. Any other questions for Lily or Jack, or both? No? Oh, Hanif, do you want to come in? Kaylin will allow you to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, I was just really fascinated by the whole process you took, and I've been comparing it with budgetary participation, which is a concept that started off in Brazil, but don't know if you've heard of that, but it gives communities the power to spend council budgets via panels, where different representatives of the community say we want it on street lighting or whatever. And that's been quite organic. So it's fascinating to see the journey you've gone through, which was quite in depth. You've put the work into it to ensure that the clashes don't happen and so forth. Whereas places like Rochdale, who are kind of experimenting with budgetary participation, are, you know, they've like smacked the head against the wall a few times and then got the, whereas if there's a process, like you said, meticulously following what could and could not work in the UK and what parts should be adopted and what shouldn't, I think it would have been more seamless. But then I suppose that's part of the journey.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hanif. I mean, I'm not familiar with the budgetary participation method that you've mentioned, but I mean, I completely agree with the principle. I mean, definitely we found that, you know, no individual person has all of the pieces of the puzzle here. You need to speak to referrers, practitioners, potential participants, whether that's fathers who would be eligible for the program, or their partners, or their children. So yeah, speaking to as many people as possible was essential. And I think this kind of pre-implementation thinking is, you know, it's not just important for adaptation specific circumstances. I think, you know, it's much better to do that careful thinking ahead of time, rather than to learn the hard way in the field when resources have already been committed, I think. So we thought it was a sort of really value adding and important piece of work, I think.
Thanks, Jack. Any other questions before we move on? Again, similar, if anything comes to your mind during the next presentation for questions for Jack or Lily, just put the question in the chat and we'll pick it up right at the end. So thank you, Jack and Lily. We're now going to move on to our final presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Wendy Pimblett, who's an Implementation Relationships Manager at the NSPCC, and her colleague Emma Smith, who's Senior Evaluation Officer at the NSPCC. And they are going to be talking about the NSPCC Domestic Abuse Recovering Together programme, or DART as most people know it as. And just also to let you know that the Youth Endowment Fund did fund a feasibility study for DART, and that study is now complete. So, Kaylin, when you're ready to share the slides, and over to you, Wendy and Emma. Thank you.
Very mild technical difficulties on my end. Apparently, it's still loading up. Sorry. But Wendy, okay, we're good to go.
Good to go. Great. Thank you, Kaylin. And thank you, Gail, and thank you, everybody. It's great to be here to be able to talk about DART. I'm really pleased that I can say DART after the way that Gail introduced it, because it is a bit of a mouthful to keep on saying the full title. So I'm the implementation manager for DART, and what that means is that I'm responsible for scaling the programme with our external partners across the UK. Emma is our evaluation specialist, and she's going to talk about all of that, later on. So what I'm going to do is just go through all about DART, what it is and how we scale it. So next slide, please, Kaylin. Oh, thank you. Very quick. Okay. Right, so as you can see from this slide here, DART has been around for quite some time. It initially started in 2005, and we're very pleased to say that it's still going strong. It was developed by one of our NSPCC service centres and further developed by the NSPCC across different service centres for quite some time. And then because of the success of that in 2015, it was decided that it was a good thing to scale externally outside of the NSPCC so that more children and mums could really benefit from the service. So that's what we did. Externally, as Emma will explain, that also went extremely well. So we have since 2015 licensed almost 50 external partners, and we now have about 27 active external partners, as well as 5 of our NSPCC hubs are also delivering DART. Our partners range from local authorities to domestic abuse charities and children's charities, so a real mixture. Next slide, please, Kaylin. So what is DART? DART helps children recover from the adverse effects of domestic abuse by working both with the mother and child together to strengthen their relationship and help both of them talk about and recover from the abuse. It's based on research by the University of Warwick, which shows that children's outcomes are improved if the non-abusing parent is supported to take an active part in the child's recovery from that abuse. So, as you're probably aware, mums are often not aware of everything that the child has seen and heard. And quite often they've not actually talked about the abuse for fear of upsetting each other even further. So the relationship is damaged, and DART aims to kind of help that further. So next slide, please. So these are the main aims. Throughout the sessions, the aim is to improve the communication between the mother and the child, really supporting them very closely to explore their feelings and emotions and discuss the abuse together and with their peer groups as well. It gives them a better understanding of how the abuse has impacted on their actual relationship and supports them to move forward as a family unit. So the idea of DART is that it just doesn't end as soon as they walk out after the 10th session. It really helps to develop their positive relationships moving forward at home once they've completed the programme. Next slide, please, Kaylin. So just some key features about DART, so you're aware of what it is. It runs over 10 consecutive weeks, and it is a group work programme, and it's supported by a manual. It's for mums and their children aged 7 to 14. Mums can attend with more than one child, but not at the same time, because each relationship is different with each child. We have known on many occasions, both internally in the NSPCC and externally with our partner sites, that mums come back time and again with their kind of second, third child, because it's had such an impact for them. The sessions are split, so the groups come together to start off with, and they work together for about 50 minutes or so on an activity. Then after a break, they split off into a mum's group and into a children's group, and then they do separate activities with their peers. 4 facilitators are required, so that 2 can go into the mum's group and 2 can go in and support the children's group as well. Towards the end of that, the mums and children come back together and share what they've done, if it's appropriate to do so, or play a game or do kind of mindfulness activity prior to leaving the group. There are a set of outcomes that must be met at the start of each of the sessions, but how the practitioners get to those outcomes is up to them. There are suggested activities throughout each of the sessions, but they can be adapted, and the activities that the NSPCC has provided are not mandatory. We also suggest that 5 families is a really good number, just because of the size, obviously, of the group and the nature of the discussions and support that is needed. But obviously no less than 3 families, because otherwise it's really not a group otherwise than that. Okay, next slide, please, Kelly. So the foundations of DART are really the rigorous assessment process. We do 3 assessments, one with the mum, one with the child, and then one with the mum and the child together. One thing to note is that the families cannot attend if the perpetrator is still part of the household or in a relationship with the mum, but they can be having contact with the child. And the main exclusions are really where the mum isn't in the right place to support the child. We find that it's always often best, where possible, for the mum to have already done some work on her own feelings and emotions, so that she's in a place to be able to work with the child kind of going forward. And obviously, if the child's unable to participate, if any other forms of abuse are found out as during the assessments, then obviously they have to be dealt with first prior to attending DART. Yeah, and if the child can obviously has the opportunity to do some work on their own first, that would be great too. But as we've already heard, there is a bit of a patchwork of provision out there, so that's not always possible for the children, sadly. Next slide, please. So in terms of moving on to when we scale DART, as you've already seen from just some of the things I've explained to you there, there's quite a lot to consider when an organisation decides that they'd like to take on DART. So we really work with our external partners right from the start, looking at all the practical elements prior to them progressing with the programme. So the assessment process must be used with each family, exactly the same one, as it identifies suitability to attend the DART programme, but also means that group considerations can be factored in, such things as age ranges. We really advise our partners to work obviously with primary school children together and secondary school children together where possible, and also to make any additional changes or adaptations after any kind of needs have been identified during the assessment, and that could be around activities or general things. It really depends. They must also ensure they've got the right staff to run the programme, the room and space to deliver it, because obviously you're looking at 14 people in a room, and then 2 separate rooms so the adults can go off to a separate room, and then potentially a space as well in case anybody needs some time out. So it is resource intensive. The 4 facilitators are also required to have a thorough understanding of domestic abuse, and obviously also have a lead that can assess the risk and hold that risk throughout the programme. So DART is quite time intensive and resource intensive, and as part of the kind of readiness and implementation process that we do with our external partners, we work with them to support them on that. Next slide, please. So this is what we do when we scale DART. So when an organisation first comes into contact with us, we have quite a long chat about DART, pretty similar to what I'm explaining to you now, to make sure that they feel it's right for them. We then ask them to complete a readiness assessment, and then we have another meeting to go through that to make sure that the service is suitable for them and for them to take on and provide in their community. Once that's completed, we then train them, and that's 1.5 days of virtual training. We also, once an organisation has delivered a whole programme of DART, we also give them access to our Train the Trainer programme, because we really want to make them sustainable going forward, so that they don't have to come back to us for more training, so that if any of their trained practitioners leave. So yeah, that's another thing we do. All the materials are accessed via our DART SharePoint site, and the implementation support continues throughout their first programme and beyond, really, because we are available to them for any challenges or issues that they may have, any questions. But also after that, we run quarterly community of practice sessions as well. We're very much led by our community in terms of we ask them what they want to talk about, and we all get together and have particular discussions about certain areas. More recently, we did one on the assessment sessions, just going through and saw how everybody did those. So yeah, it's a really great network. We've also set up a DART implementation network as well for all the leads from our external partners. And what happens there is that they, once again, they've delivered DART, they can access other people's details and to ask them questions, and encourage them to be, a community on their own as well. Any organisations that might join us who are in a similar geographical kind of location as each other, we encourage them as well to support each other where possible. We do have examples of some of our NSPCC hubs working with some of our external partners as well, and that's worked really well. So we also meet with our external partners and do annual kind of reviews to make sure everything's okay, and we also do a more formal license review at the end of the 3rd year. Next slide, please, Caitlin. So this is my last slide. So this is just one of the things that Emma's going to talk about and explain more is some of the great outcomes for children and their mums. But we've also got some really passionate practitioners out there who are delivering DART both within the NSPCC and externally. This is one example from one of our larger partners. A couple of years ago, we trained 45 of their staff, and they've gone on to absolutely love to deliver DART. The implementation lead, sent us this. The work we've done around DART here in Durham has been hugely successful. The enthusiasm shown by trained practitioners to deliver the DART programme is like nothing I've seen before. Everyone loves it. They love the programme, the exercises, and the whole ethos around DART. So it was a great pleasure working with Durham County Council on that. And we've got lots of examples as well from our partner sites, who often share with us the information that they gain from their last session of DART, where we ask the families, the children and the mums to write letters or draw pictures about their experience during DART to share with the next group. And often they share some of those, which are really amazing and quite emotional as well. So yeah, it's really, really good. So that's it from me. And I'm now going to pass on to Emma to go through the evaluation side.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the evaluations that we've done so far, the main ones. So it's going to be quite high level because I've just got 10 minutes. If you can go to the next slide. So we did two main internal impact evaluations. One was of the first NSPCC sites. There were 8 sites delivered by the NSPCC. It was a quasi-experimental design. We had a small comparison group, but it was non-matched. We used mixed methods. We also did some interviews with NSPCC practitioners, children, and mothers who attended the programme. And we did a survey as well of people who referred to the DART programme. So we also collected standardised measures data. So the mothers did Rosenberg self-esteem scale, parent acceptance and rejection questionnaire, strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and the parent locus of control scale, which is a couple of factors for that, which we're looking at confidence in parenting and how much influence they felt they had over their child. The children completed a child version of the park as well, so you've got their perspectives on their mother's relationship. So for the first study, we contacted lots of agencies trying to get some comparison, see if we could get comparison data, or they could join in with an impact study, and it was quite a challenge. We got one Women's Refuge who did have some historical strengths and difficulties data, which they were able to share with us for the purposes of comparison, and they had a similar sort of time point because DART's a 10-week program where they did their before and after. So that's what we did basically, and the focus of this evaluation was basically, does DART work when it's does it lead to better outcomes for families affected by domestic abuse? Next slide, please. So for the second evaluation, this was after that positive the evaluation findings, that was part of the decision to scale up the programme once we learned that it seemed to be working. So we then wanted to see, well, how well is it working outside of the NSPCC, where it's a bit potentially more of a challenge in terms of things like resource and that sort of thing. So we did a similar sort of design, quasi-experimental. This time we had 2 comparison groups. Again, they were smaller than we would like. Well, the first one wasn't. It was data from the first NSPCC DART evaluation, because we wanted to compare against that to see if we would have similar outcomes as the first families who went through the programme. The second group were families who were being assessed who were waiting to attend DART. So they had a period where they were waiting that naturally allowed us to look at some before and after measures. And then our intervention group in this case was the non-NSPCC sites delivering DART. And we just looked at the pre and post data. I forgot to say, for the other evaluation, we also did a time 3. So we looked to see if outcomes were sustained 6 months later. We chose a smaller number of standardised measures this time because of speaking to the external sites who said they wouldn't manage much more than what we collected. So we had to adapt it a little bit because of that. But again, we can see similar measures. We did the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. We had a parent-child relationship inventory, which was a new one because we reviewed some of the measures. And we did the SDQ again. This time the children did an SDQ as well. And all the measures, the same measures, were completed by the intervention groups and the comparison groups. So in this case, the focus of the evaluation was whether or not sites delivering DART externally would have similar outcomes as NSPCC sites. Next slide, please. So I've combined the findings from both studies because of time and because there's quite a lot of repetition, really. There was basically both evaluations found very positive statistical significant differences pre and post DART to all the key outcomes that we looked at. So mothers had better self-esteem after DART, children had fewer emotional and behavioural issues as measured by the SDQ, and there were some indicators from some of the measures we were looking at of an improved relationship between mothers and children as well. And then also in both studies, our intervention group fared better than the comparison group on some of the measures. we were fairly confident that, you know, DART has a good impact. But I have to acknowledge the limitations of the study, which we've tried to improve on, and that's why we got into, you know, the YF got in touch with us as well to try and do that. So sample size of the comparison group was much smaller. It was really hard to recruit for the comparison group. And we weren't, because of the numbers, we weren't able to do like a matching process or anything like that. It was families that had experienced domestic abuse and not in the same situation, but we didn't match, you know, and they were similar in terms of the areas they were in, but we didn't match in terms of other demographics and things like that. But we did what we could with the data that we had. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a brief, I could go on for ages about the qualitative findings, but I haven't got long. So I'm just going to talk about the main findings that were the strongest, I would say. So something that came across really strongly was about how DART seemed to help to give children a voice. Often, and this is confirmed by research as well, the mothers have had underestimated the extent to which their children had been aware of the abuse and affected by the abuse, but the sort of the nature of the activities that we do in DART, it's about the children being able to share that and talk about that, and in a safe sort of supported way, which could be quite upsetting for the mothers to hear at times, but the ones that I interviewed were all saying that it was generally a good thing because it helped them to understand how to support their child better in the future, and also understand reasons for their behaviours, like their challenging behaviours. Sometimes they hadn't really put it two and two together, that it was partly related to the domestic abuse experience. So I've got a few quotes here. I won't read them all out. I'll read a couple, but so my son never spoke to me about how he felt. He made a house, showing me crying in the bedroom and the perpetrator on top of me, and my son crying. It hit home to me. I thought he'd forgotten about it, but these things were still in his mind. I never thought he thought about it anymore. And another key thing, which was a core aim of DART, is that it helped to improve their relationship. So there's lots of activities that are about trying to facilitate communication, like in general as well, activities to help mothers and children bond together. So you'll see with some of the other quotes I've put as well, there's quite a lot from practitioners, from mothers, from children, about the relationship being improved afterwards. Next slide, please. And then the creative activities. I heard a lot about the creative activities in DART, but what impressed me the most, I think, because I interviewed quite a lot of children. There was about 15 children I interviewed. That the creative activities, they all had a purpose. So they were about trying to convey some kind of message about just how to deal with their feelings in relation to the abuse, for example, or that kind of thing. So the one activity in this quote that the child is talking about is an activity where they make volcanoes, a feelings volcano, and they talk about how they've been feeling about things related to the abuse. They stick things on it. It's a paper mache, or I think there's various range of volcanoes you can make, but the one I read was about a paper mache volcano. You put bicarbonate of soda in, you put some vinegar in, and it explodes. And not only was it a fun thing for them to do, but actually I think they really remembered it. And you can see the message they said. And I'd interviewed them a few months after they did that as well, and it was just a young child, it was about 8. The volcano activity meant the more and more anger you keep inside you, it just maybe bursts out on a person who hasn't done anything. So yeah, and I think I mentioned before, DART helps mothers understand the reasons, some of the reasons for the children's challenging behaviour. And another impact of that, which was mentioned by a few of the mothers, was that they said that they had been thinking about would they go back to the perpetrator, missing the perpetrator, that kind of thing, but actually having a fuller understanding about how their child had been affected had made them realise they couldn't do that. And also a strong theme was them understanding that the abuse is not their fault as well. I won't read out this quote, but it's, as you'll see the slides afterwards, but you can see about how this mother talks about how her child's behaviour had improved. And he used to worry about, if I ever got up with a bad man again. I've reassured him I'm not, I'm going to stay on my own. So yeah, okay, next slide. So there were some challenges as well that were quite common with the DART delivery. There was a small number of mothers who did resume a relationship with the perpetrators, which unsurprisingly, you know, undid the positive progress that had happened from attending DART. And some of the facilitators said that it could be quite challenging to manage the children's behaviours. Obviously, they've been through a lot, so that could be difficult, at least at the start. And sometimes some of the mothers did say at the start, at least, that some of the emotive, the content of the programme could make children's behaviour a bit worse in the future. It could make them a bit angrier when they were thinking about things that they'd experienced. But largely, and you can see from our standardised measures results, like the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, overall, by the end of the programme and beyond, when we looked at the 6 months, the behaviour had improved. So it might be it's a bit of a process that has to happen. And another thing was sometimes when mothers formed new relationships with other people, that could cause anxiety, which you can kind of understand why. Next slide, please. So just this finally about the practitioners and the referrers that we interviewed as well. So one thing that came through from the practitioner and referrer feedback that we got was that DART seemed quite a unique programme, because they said other programmes like this didn't have such a strong focus on the mother-child relationship. And it's all, you know, we've got half of the sessions are joint, the mothers and child are one-on-one. So that was kind of something that they felt was new and different and helpful. And they talked a lot about the sorts of positive outcomes that they'd observed. And I will read this quote because it's quite lovely. It's from a practitioner. There was one mum who initially did not want to do the activities with his mum. He did not want to be near her and he'd sit away from her. The physical affection was not there. As the group progressed, he became more accepting of his mum's affection. They were laughing together. She was stroking him. He would go to his mum for affection and she would respond appropriately. And then from a referrer as well, you can see a quote there about how the client's seen a marked improvement in her son's behaviours as well, and that the son understood that none of it was his fault. It happened in other families, and that was another common thing, realising it's not just them. Okay, next slide, please. So now onto the YEF feasibility study. So YEF got in touch with us saying that they would like to kind of improve on this evidence base and do, because this was, you know, it was internal, it had limitations. They were particularly interested in doing a randomised control trial. I'll answer the questions at the end just so I don't lose my flow. Yeah, so they after some conversations, we decided it would probably be wise to do a feasibility study first. So that's what they did. It's King's College London carried this out. So they analysed all our admin data from the NSPCC sites, from the external sites as well, completion, attrition, interviewed some of the DART practitioners about things like attitudes to different types of designs, and they did some observations of DART planning sessions as well. Next slide, please. So in short, the findings were kind of unsurprising to us because I think we discussed a lot of these with the YEF at the beginning, that we were worried a bit about numbers. We were worried about how practitioners might feel about things like randomising. It's not really in their culture to randomise. They want to help the families. They don't want to turn people away. And, you know, that came through quite strongly from this evaluation. And you can see a couple of quotes there. They were worried that, you know, if you don't offer intervention, and with, as we know, the intervention out there is patchy, so business as usual, there isn't much business as usual. They don't like the idea of assessing people and then putting them on a waiting list or them not getting interventions. So that was a strong that would have been a strong challenge in terms of doing a RCT, because you have to get the practitioners on board, really. The numbers were a big challenge. We didn't really have enough starting and completing DART for either an RCT or a more robust study where we did the matching process. And there were limited and inconsistent referral routes, which posed some challenges as well about when could you randomise. Next slide, please. In conclusion, so we have had some positive findings from our evaluations, and it's unfortunate that we're unable to currently validate these with an RCT or an equivalent design. It's not to say that we can't do that in the future, but maybe at the moment, with the provision the way it is and the numbers that we're getting through, it's not quite ready yet. And at the moment, Wendy and the team, DART team, are doing various work to try and modernise DART, because it is what's more than 10 years old now, and ensuring it's, trauma informed and thinking about those sorts of issues. And we're ongoing having lots of interest in DART and sites that want to scale it up. And that's the end.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Emma. That was so interesting. Do you want to stop sharing the slides, Kaylin? We've just got a couple of minutes before we wrap up. There's one question in the chat, Emma, about what's the criteria for putting groups together? Is it age, is it locality, or is it anything else? Do you want to pick that one up first?
Wendy probably answered that best.
That'd be me. Yeah. In general, it is location based, because it's quite a commitment, because it's 2 hours for 10 weeks each week. So the families have to live close to the provider. To travel a long way, especially school age children, makes it rather difficult. And then the age of the children, yes, absolutely. Often a 7-year-old has very different language to a 14-year-old, so we wouldn't recommend putting them in groups together. So that's why the assessment is so thorough, to make sure that the families you're putting together in the groups will work well together and work well as peer groups, things like that. We have had one group that has been running since 2015 who did do a mixed age group, and it worked really, really well. But they've been doing it for a very long time and felt very confident on their assessment that they could do that. But the majority of our sites do it in age ranges to make sure it kind of works. But there's lots of other things that they have to consider, obviously.
Thanks, Wendy. A couple of follow-up questions. How much cost per child? ? Oh gosh, there's loads of questions now, and we might only be able to take a couple. So cost per child. We also have a question: if the mum is the abuser, can dad attend the programme? And did you try to change the views of practitioners about RCTs?
Emma, do you want to do that last one first, and then I'll go backwards?
Well, King's did that last study. So, I mean, we were never internally proposing to do an RCT, so that came from YEF and King's. And I think the views, you'll see in their report, they're quite strong views. So, and because of the other issues, I think, because of the numbers and the rest of it, no, we didn't really, because I don't think it would have been feasible anyway. And
Wendy, cost per child?
Yeah.
And also, can dads attend the programme?
At the moment, no. Dads can't attend the programme. DART is evidence-based on the Duluth power model and male violence against females. So we can't actually say that it would work. Not to say that some of our sites do use parts of DART, but it can't be called DART, because that's what it's been evaluated upon. It is something that, Emma mentioned us, modernising it and changing it. A lot of change has changed since 2005, and we're really aware of that. So we are looking at funding at the moment to try and do that, because it's a massive, redevelopment project. So at the moment, no, but that doesn't mean that we don't recognise that mums can be abusers too. Same-sex relationships, there's lots of areas that DART doesn't cover, and that's what we'd like to address, obviously, as well. So yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Wendy. And I'm going to call a close now, because we are 30 seconds from the end. There's also a question there, Wendy, about are there different programmes for boys and girls? And I think there might even be another question. So what we could do, if you're okay, Wendy, we could collate some of those questions, and then we can also maybe put those on the website as well when we upload the recording and the slides. Actually, people are thanking you very much, all of you presenters. So thank you again for our fabulous presenters. It's been a brilliant session. Thank you everybody for attending. It's been such a good turnout, and hopefully you can get a chance to share the slides and the recording with colleagues who might be interested. Yanina has put a link to the feedback form in the chat. Please, please, please fill it out. We really appreciate your feedback about our virtual learning cafes, and because we also want to improve and learn. But thank you once again for your time this afternoon. Have a good rest of day. Bye, everybody.
Bye.